Hello, Fort Mill High School. I'm Mr. Young, your career development facilitator. And before you, I have my good friend, the good Dr. J. Aaron Simmons. How you doing today?
Hey, man, I am above ground, wheels down, head up, doing great.
Yes, sir. So I tell you what, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into being a philosopher?
Yeah. So it turns out that how I got into a philosopher is an interesting story, but it connects to who I am. So I'm Aaron Simmons. I teach at Furman University, professor of philosophy here. Before coming to Furman, I taught at Hendrix College in Arkansas, was also at Sewanee, the University of the South in Tennessee, and then taught at Vanderbilt for a while as well. So I've been at a lot of different kinds of places, different levels of institution, but my whole career has been spent being a college professor. Now, how I got into it, I was like many, a young college student wanting to do something else. And so I went to college thinking I was going to be an engineer, wanted to study physics. And the reason, I don't know who's the physics teacher there at Fort Mill, but my physics teacher in Brandon, Florida was amazing. We used to, like throw eggs off of roofs and figure out what would, how many forces would be required to break them and, shoot arrows and track the parabolas. It was such a hands-on class. I was hooked. I wanted to be a physicist. Got to college, and my physics professor was not, shall we say, at the cool kids table. This was a man who struggled to button his shirt up correctly and who definitely didn't have anybody love him enough to tell him to shave his chest hair that would poke out of his shirt misbuttoned, right? So he rocked a pocket protector and tape on his glasses, and you're just the stereotype of a math guy, right? And one day I was sitting in his class and I thought, I can't be that guy. And so I got up, I dropped the major, didn't know what to do. I had a young lady that I was pretty attracted to and said, hey, we should go to Europe and study away. And so I thought, well, that sounds as good an idea as I've ever heard. And so went to Europe, studied in Cambridge, England for about 4 or 5 months. And while I was there, never actually fell in love with the girl. We parted company, but while I was there, I fell in love with culture and ideas and art and music. And it's something when you're sitting, looking at Gothic cathedrals or looking at a Michelangelo statue in Italy. It was just something that blew my mind. And when I came back, I thought, I want to do that stuff. I didn't know what that stuff was. So I took a class in history, a class in religion, and a class in literature, and decided that I liked history the best. So I ended up majoring in history. And about this time, my dad, who had been a college professor for a long time, got hired at the school where I was. And so my last 2 years in college, he was now one of my professors. And dude, we fished like 80 days a year. And I thought, I want this job. So it turns out my career choices were influenced by following a girl to Europe, falling in love with art, fishing with my dad, and then saying, I guess being a professor is what does that. So then I did the stupidest thing ever, Mr. College Counselor. I decided to go to grad school to become a professor, but I didn't know where to go or what to study. But I was a Florida State Seminoles fan. So I applied to Florida State University for no other reason than to go down there and cheer on the Seminoles. And while I was there, I ended up taking courses in philosophy. And that's what actually got me into philosophy. So being a philosophy professor was not some long-standing commitment. The commitment was I wanted to do with my life something that I enjoyed and something I thought was worthwhile. And watching my dad love being a professor and then having all this flexibility was something that I thought was worth, pursuing. Philosophy came as a kind of focus later on while I was probably shirtless, diving over a bunch of human bodies in the student section at Florida State University. So,
But what I absolutely love about your story is that it proves once again there's no straight line.
that's right.
It's not a bell curve. It's more like up and down, and we're going in different directions. And for our students who are watching, remember, your path is your path. It doesn't have to look like anybody else's. So this is a thank you. I really appreciate your transparency here. Now, and how long have you been in philosophy?
So let's see. I've been teaching philosophy since 2000. So 23 years, I guess. I got my PhD in 2005. So 18 years actually with a doctorate, as a full professor kind of a thing, but taught in grad school, starting in 2000. So coming up on my 25th year doing this stuff, man. And I should say, as far as curvy lines,
Mm-hmm.
um, I just published a new book called Camping with Kierkegaard. And in that book, I have a whole chapter about finding a calling, which of
Mm-hmm.
course connects to this idea of how do we figure out what to do with our life and, career orientations. And I use, the song by Drake called Hotline Bling, right?
Yes.
When the hotline bling, it can only mean one thing.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out, now in his case, he just means kind of some booty. But in our case, my argument in the book is it never means one thing. The call can mean lots of stuff. And what matters is how you then respond to it. And so for students in high school, I've got a son who's 14, starting high school himself. We talk a lot about, man, it's not, well, this is what I want to do. It's, hey, what blows your hair back? There's probably 15 different things that would let you do that in different capacities. And so, that flexibility, being able to not think when the hotline bling, there's only one way on. Turns out there's a whole bunch of ways to get where you think might be worth being. And so I absolutely got to where I am with a very curvy route, but it's a route that when I look back, I think, man, that made lots of sense. And the whole time I was making the best decision I could with the information I had at the time.
And what's great about that is it literally relates to how I describe our town of Fort Mill. It's about 5 different ways to get to the same 3 places. You're going to get there, but the question is, are you taking path A, B, C, or whatever?
Yeah.
So I think that's great. But once you find out what you really want to do, then you go from there.
Then you go. That's right.
That's cool. That's cool. So almost 25 years. What are some of the best things about your career?
Oh, man. So I think it's kind of in categories. So one category, which is actually what kind of drew me to it, was the flexibility. Being a professor is one of those things where, unlike being a high school teacher, which God bless all y'all, you are more virtuous than me. In college, we don't teach, from 8 to 3 every day. We instead have classes, maybe 2 days a week, maybe 3 days a week. Every semester, you'll have classes at different times, and you can schedule these in different ways, given what you're trying to do or what kind of class it is. And so that flexibility allows me a lot of time to be invested in the stuff that I love: fishing, hiking, mountain biking, being with my family, etc. So now I should make clear to students, it's not that I work less hours than somebody else. It's just the way those hours look are a little bit more up to me, other than when my classes meet. If I've got to get a book written, if I've got to, write recommendation letters or do some grading, all that happens sort of as I want it to look. And that flexibility is really powerful. So I love the flexibility in my career. 2, I love the fact that I get to invite students to think about who they want to become. So in some ways, I get to do a lot of what you get to do. And so being able to think with students about philosophy, which are really big questions: what's justice? What is good? What is true? What's beautiful? These sorts of questions are ultimately all about who am I? Where am I trying to go? And why does it matter? And so being able to think for 25 years almost with a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds, right? Because they stay the same. I just keep getting older.
Right.
All my hip hop references are like my dad likes that group. And I'm like, man, yeah.
Like,
But I love that I get to invite students to think carefully about who they want to be and what they want to do with their lives. And then third, I would say the coolest thing about my career is I'm also an author. So I'm not just a teacher of philosophy, but I'm a philosopher. And this is also something that's kind of hard to understand until you get to college. In junior high school, the teachers, their first identity is as teacher. They teach this material. When you get up to the university level, we do the things that we teach at some level. And so I write the books in philosophy that then are taught at other universities. And so I love being able to contribute to these conversations happening among scholars around the world about the biggest, most important ideas ever. And as one of my students had a t-shirt made for our philosophy club here, just said, philosophy, a real big, long, important party. was like, that's exactly right. And so I love the fact that I get to contribute to that party, as it were, by writing books, giving talks, being able to be what it is that I get to teach about is also pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. So we acknowledge the sunshine, all the good parts. Let's talk about the shadow. What are some
Oh,
things
there's
that
some
aren't
shadow.
so great?
Yeah. So all the flexibility I talked about, I didn't have much of that before I had what we call tenure. So tenure in the university and higher education is this idea that when you've put in some number of years, usually it's between 6 to 10 years, that then you get to go up for a particular kind of review. And if you are approved, it means that your job becomes just a little bit more secure. So it's before that, it's every year you're evaluated and you may or may not get rehired. And so getting tenure was a big deal because until that point, when I talk about flexibility, I was putting in 80 hours a week. And so there wasn't any flexibility because it was just slammed. I was doing everything for everybody, saying yes to everything, trying to write, trying to teach, trying to be at all the student events, trying to make sure I volunteer, trying to mentor, advise. And so the flexibility came at the cost of, really, in my case, about 15 years of what we would say was, grinding, right? And so I was grinding for a minute before I was able to say, man, like, I think I'm gonna go fishing a little bit more. And so that definitely is a side of this field I didn't understand, because I watched my dad, he already had tenure. So when I watched him fish all the time, like, I didn't understand that he had put in 15, 20 years to get to where that kind of flexibility was possible, right? And then also it is interestingly weird as a teacher, as a person who, works with students. It's weird to do the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And so one of the dark sides or shadows of my field is my career is, as a professor, I have lots of different things I can teach, a lot of different ways I can do it. And I try to mix it up as much as I can. But at the end of the day, there's also a, intro to philosophy is generally going to be an intro to philosophy. And so I've taught it so many times that it kind of gets boring. And you start knowing what all the questions are going to be before the hands go up. And you already know when this person's getting mad about something, like, man, we just had this conversation like 4 months ago with that other dude, right? Yeah. So there is definitely a cyclical exhaustion that kind of happens where you've done it a lot. And this would be true, I think, for every career, every field. It's what the author David Foster Wallace calls the day in, day out monotony of adult, right? To be adult is to do the day in, day out monotony, and then to swing through Publix or Walmart or whatever on the way home to grab something for dinner, to get there and spend your time making dinner. And then your kid's mad because it's not what they wanted to eat and they're ticked off. They don't want to do their homework. You're trying to get their homework done, but you've actually got your stuff to get done for the next day, which has to now wait until they stop their attitude, get them to bed. Well, now you're so pissed and annoyed, you don't want to do your work, but you got to get it done. And the next day you get up and you get to do it all over again. So there is a reality to adulting that I think plagues whatever career you have, unless you are lucky enough to be just so independently wealthy that every day is a vacation. I think it's important for, kids to kind of get that, to understand, hey, whatever I do I have the fortitude, the strength, the resilience to say, look, I'm committed here. And so let's do this. Same thing with marriage, right? You can get married. Like, there's a lot of awesome days. There's also a lot of day in, day out. And so getting out of bed saying, no, I committed to this, we're going to make this work. That's part of what it looks like also in a career.
I'd say so. For another hip hop reference that might become outdated soon, there's levels to this, right?
Yeah,
there's levels to this. So I think sometimes with our students, we want to be the CEO immediately. We want to be the president immediately. But there's entry level, there's ground level work, there's mid-level management. There are levels that you have to achieve before you get to the pinnacle.
Well, I mean, it's Jay-Z, right? Everybody now sees Jay-Z as the mogul,
right.
The biggest name with the hottest girl wearing his chain. Like, he's that guy. But we tend to forget, hard knock life. This is the guy saying, from standing on the corner popping to being one of the hottest people we've ever heard. Like, he had to make that move. And the same Will Smith, before he started smacking Chris Rock around, he had an amazing line in one of his songs that I tell students all the time, like, that's life. It's, I paid dues, now dudes pay attention.
Mm.
right? Like
Yes.
that line, man, that's all that counseling is saying you got to pay dues so dudes pay attention. And being able to stand on that street corner, rapping with your friends, and maybe one day, if you stick at this, that there's different ways forward. It's important to understand that they've all put the time in. They've all, been grinding for years that we don't get to see when they just walk the red carpet. And so, whatever the career is that you want to be a physician? Awesome, man. Like 8 years of school ain't no joke. You want to be a professor? I was in school, like your students will immediately run for the exit, but kindergarten through 12th grade, that number of years is how many years I was in school after I graduated from high school.
Wow.
So, that's a commitment. That's a serious investment. But now, like I mountain biked 2,000 miles last year. I fish at least 1 or 2 days a week. I also write books all the time and give lectures around the world. And yesterday I had people reaching out to me from Australia, read my new book saying, man, I really enjoyed this. And somebody from South Africa this morning I Zoomed with who was reading some of my stuff and wanted to get some advice on some things. So that is not what happened year one. Year one, I was sleeping in my office half the time, trying to burn the candle at both ends. But then sticking with that, being committed to excellence and saying, I'm going to find some joy, even while I'm, spending a lot of hours in the office. It eventually, I think, something that makes a life worth living. Right. And that's what I hope for everybody.
Absolutely. You got to have grit, determination, commitment. I love what you're saying right now. So,
Yeah, man.
last thing before we let you go, what's one piece of advice that you would give to our students when they're doing their career search?
Oh, it's such a good question. So the advice I would give them, because I'm going to assume that a lot of these interviews you've been doing, people have advised things like make sure that you get lots of perspectives, make sure you ask questions from people in that field, make sure that you try to find internships so you can try on for side and see if it works for you. Make sure that you, are willing to understand what the on-ramp looks like. These are all really important things. But because I'm assuming they got those important things said already, I'm going to say something else, which is, y'all, you are not your career. So my advice is do not confuse your value, your dignity, your moral significance with the amount of money you got in the bank or the amount of people that answer to you as a boss or the amount of letters you've got behind your name, like with a fancy PhD behind mine. None of that stuff ultimately matters when it comes to what's most important. And I worked construction to pay my way through college. Those people I worked construction with, I'm not better than them. And they almost every single day are working harder than I am now. And so being able to recognize, look, what matters is that I'm able to be comfortable with who I am, that I live a life that is virtuous, that I'm okay standing before my grandma and her knowing what I do in my life. As far as I'm concerned, if you do that stuff, the career, all the other stuff's going to get figured out eventually. Just inertia is going to get that stuff worked out at some level. But do not confuse your significance and your value for the externals, like fancy careers, fancy cars, and a whole lot of money. If you get confused on that, man, it just doesn't matter. There's a lot of rich people running around that are absolute garbage humans. And I would rather not be rich and be kind. So finding a way to invite my son to understand that is what I'm trying to do. And I would say the same thing to any one of your students.
Absolutely. I'd say that's a perfect way to end it. Doctor, I really appreciate you. Thank you so much. Students, remember, if something that you heard today sparked your interest, feel free to find me in the main guidance office, and we'll see y'all next time. Thank you now. Bye-bye.